August 17, 1943. 30,000 feet above Regensburg, Germany. Second Lieutenant Robert Morgan gripped the control yoke of his B-17F as flak burst around his formation like black flowers blooming in the pristine blue sky. This was his 25th mission. One more, and his crew would complete their tour, rotation home, survival against odds that said they shouldn't still be alive. The Memphis Belle, as his crew had named their aircraft, shuddered as a flak fragment tore through the aluminum skin somewhere behind him. Through the intercom came the calm voice of his tail gunner. "Fighters, 6 o'clock high. Looks like a whole swarm coming in." Morgan had been flying B-17s for nearly a year. He'd seen crews disappear in balls of fire, watched friends spiral down trailing smoke, counted empty bunks in barracks that had been full weeks before. The statistics were brutal. In August 1943, the average B-17 crew had a 1 in 4 chance of completing a 25-mission tour. 3 out of 4 would be dead, captured, or too wounded to fly again. But the B-17 kept flying. It absorbed punishment that should have brought it down. It carried its crew through fighter attacks that shredded other bombers. It brought damaged aircraft home on 2 engines, sometimes 1, when physics said it was impossible. The men who flew it called it the Flying Fortress, and they trusted it with their lives in a way they trusted nothing else. What Morgan and thousands of other airmen didn't fully understand was that they were participants in a grand strategic experiment, an attempt to prove that bombers could win wars without massive ground invasions, that industrial capacity could be destroyed from the air, that civilian morale could be broken, that Germany could be bombed into submission. The experiment would fail in its most ambitious goals. But the B-17 would succeed beyond anyone's expectations, not by winning the war alone, but by proving that strategic bombing could fundamentally change how wars were fought. This is the story of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the bomber that didn't win the war by itself but made Allied victory possible. It's the story of how American industrial might, aircrew courage, and engineering excellence combined to create a weapon that could survive what no bomber should survive. And it's the story of how 30,000 young men died proving that daylight precision bombing could work, even when the cost seemed too high to bear. The B-17's origins lay in a 1934 Army Air Corps specification that asked for the impossible. The military wanted a multi-engine bomber capable of carrying a ton of bombs at least 2,000 miles at speeds over 200 miles per hour. At the time, most bombers were biplane designs barely faster than World War I fighters. What the Air Corps was requesting was a quantum leap in capability. Boeing's engineering team, led by E. Gifford Emery and Edward Curtis Wells, approached the problem with characteristic ambition. Rather than design to the minimum specifications, they decided to exceed them dramatically. If the Air Corps wanted multi-engine, Boeing would give them 4 engines. If they wanted a ton of bombs, Boeing would give them 4 tons. If they wanted 2,000 miles range, Boeing would deliver 3,000. The result was the Model 299, which first flew on July 28, 1935. It was enormous by contemporary standards, dwarfing every other bomber in existence. 4 Pratt & Whitney Hornet radial engines producing 750 horsepower each gave it speed and the ability to maintain flight with engines damaged or destroyed. The defensive armament was unprecedented, 5 machine gun positions covering every approach angle. When a Seattle Times reporter saw it, he coined the name that would stick: Flying Fortress. The name was marketing genius. It captured what Boeing had created, not just a bomber but a flying weapons platform that could defend itself. The Air Corps loved it. The problem was cost. Each B-17 would cost over $200,000, an astronomical sum during the Depression. The military budget couldn't support mass production. Boeing received orders for only 13 aircraft for evaluation purposes. Then came disaster. During a demonstration flight for Air Corps brass in October 1935, the prototype Model 299 crashed, killing 2 crew members including Boeing's chief test pilot. Investigation revealed the cause. The crew had forgotten to remove the control surface locks before takeoff. The aircraft had been too complex for its crew to manage without a checklist. The crash nearly killed the program. Douglas's competing design, simpler and cheaper, won the production contract. But the Air Corps was intrigued enough by the B-17's performance to order 13 for service testing. Those 13 aircraft would prove revolutionary. They demonstrated that the 4-engine design was more reliable, not less, that the complexity could be managed with proper procedures, and that the flying fortress concept of a heavily armed, high-altitude bomber was tactically viable. As war clouds gathered over Europe, Air Corps strategists began developing a doctrine that would justify the B-17's existence. They called it precision daylight bombing. The theory was elegant. Bombers flying at high altitude in tight defensive formations could fight their way to targets without fighter escort. Bombardiers using the revolutionary Norden bombsight could hit precise targets, factories, refineries, and transportation networks. Strategic targets would be destroyed, crippling enemy war production. Germany could be bombed into defeat. The doctrine had flaws that combat would expose brutally. The Norden bombsight, while remarkable, couldn't compensate for clouds, smoke, or the chaos of combat. High-altitude defensive formations would prove vulnerable to determined fighter attacks, and precision bombing would prove far less precise than theory suggested. But the doctrine drove B-17 development and production as war approached. Boeing continued refining the design. The B-17B added turbo-superchargers, enabling operations above 30,000 feet where fighters struggled. The B-17C added self-sealing fuel tanks and more armor after British experience showed bombers were far more vulnerable than expected. The B-17D featured additional defensive armament. Each version incorporated lessons learned, though most of those lessons came from other nations' combat experience. America hadn't yet gone to war. When Pearl Harbor brought America into World War II, the Air Corps, soon to be renamed the Army Air Forces, had fewer than 200 B-17s. Most were obsolescent B-17C and D models. The latest variant, the B-17E, was just entering production with major improvements. A tail gun position eliminating the previous model's blind spot, a power-operated dorsal turret, increased armor protection, and refined aerodynamics. This was the first version designed with combat experience in mind. Production accelerated frantically. Boeing's Seattle plant expanded. Vega, a Lockheed subsidiary, built a factory in Burbank. Douglas opened a plant in Long Beach. At peak production, the 3 factories would deliver over 350 B-17s monthly. Each aircraft required 400,000 parts, 36,000 rivets, and 13 miles of electrical wiring. The manufacturing organization required to produce them at scale was itself a revolutionary achievement. The crews who would fly these aircraft into combat faced training that was rigorous but could never fully prepare them for what they would face. Pilots trained for hundreds of hours, learning to handle the B-17's idiosyncrasies. It was stable but heavy, requiring physical strength to maneuver, especially in formation. The 4-engine arrangement meant complex engine management. Lose one engine and the aircraft could maintain altitude. Lose 2 on the same wing and it became nearly uncontrollable. Bombardiers trained with the Norden bombsight, a mechanical computer of remarkable sophistication. In theory, it could drop bombs within a 100-foot circle from 30,000 feet. In practice, weather, combat damage, and enemy action made such accuracy rare. But the bombardiers believed in their equipment, and that confidence would prove important when missions required flying through hell to reach the target. Navigators learned dead reckoning and celestial navigation, essential when flying over enemy territory with no landmarks visible through clouds. Radio operators mastered their equipment and served as additional gunners. Engineers monitored systems, managed fuel transfers, and made emergency repairs in flight. Gunners trained on .50 caliber Browning machine guns, learning to lead fast-moving fighters and conserve ammunition. Each crew was a small unit, 10 men in the later models, who had to function perfectly under conditions of extreme stress. They trained together, flew together, and often died together. The crew cohesion forged in training was the intangible factor that kept B-17s flying when rational calculation said they should abort. The first major test came in August 1942 when the 8th Air Force flew its first mission against occupied Europe, hitting railroad yards at Rouen, France. 12 B-17Es escorted by Spitfires bombed from 23,000 feet. All returned safely. The mission was a propaganda success, Americans bombing Hitler's Europe, but Rouen was close to the coast, lightly defended, and covered by friendly fighters. It proved nothing about the viability of unescorted daylight raids deep into Germany. The real test came in 1943 as the 8th Air Force built up strength and began striking deeper into the Reich. The missions became bloodier. German fighters, initially surprised by the B-17's defensive firepower, developed tactics to counter it. Head-on attacks exploited the fortress's weak nose armament. Vertical attacks from above defeated the dorsal turret's limited elevation. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions overwhelmed the gunners. The losses mounted. January 1943 Bremen raid, 3 B-17s lost out of 55. February Wilhelmshaven, 4 lost. These were sustainable rates, but by summer as missions pushed deeper the mathematics turned dark. July 28 Oschersleben, 15 B-17s lost from a force of 120. August 12 Gelsenkirchen, 25 lost. Then came the missions that would define the B-17's place in history. August 17, 1943, a double strike against Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The plan was audacious. One force would bomb the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, then continue to North Africa, opening a new route for bomber operations. A second force would hit the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, critical to German war production. Together, they would deliver a knockout blow to German industry. The reality was catastrophic. The Regensburg force lost 24 B-17s. The Schweinfurt force lost 36. Combined losses were 60 bombers, 600 men killed or captured in a single day. Some groups lost over a third of their aircraft. The bombing results were mixed at best. German production recovered within weeks. The 8th Air Force had proven it could reach any target in Germany, but it had also proven it couldn't sustain such losses. The aircrews called it Black Thursday when they returned to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. The 8th Air Force dispatched 291 B-17s. German defenders threw everything at them, over 300 fighters engaging in running battles from the German border to the target and back. 60 B-17s were shot down. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. 650 men were lost. The footage of bombers exploding, breaking apart, spinning down in flames, traumatized the crews who survived. Schweinfurt forced a reckoning. Deep penetration raids without fighter escort were unsustainable. The losses couldn't be replaced fast enough. Aircrew morale was cracking. Men were completing 5, 10, 15 missions and watching their chances of survival decline with each one. The strain showed in thousand-yard stares, in trembling hands, in the silence that fell over barracks when another crew didn't return. But the missions continued, because even in failure, the raids were achieving something strategists hadn't fully anticipated. The Luftwaffe was being forced to commit its fighters to defense of the Reich. Fighters pulled from the Eastern Front. Training squadrons committed to combat. Production shifted from bombers to fighters. Germany's Air Force was being reshaped around stopping the B-17s, and in that reshaping, it was being destroyed. The B-17 itself was evolving under the pressure of combat. The B-17F model that bore the brunt of 1943's campaigns was upgraded to the B-17G with a chin turret mounting twin .50 caliber guns, finally giving the fortress the forward firepower to counter head-on attacks. Armor was increased. Self-sealing fuel tanks were improved. Oxygen systems were made more reliable. Every loss was studied, every vulnerability addressed. The aircraft's reputation for bringing crews home despite catastrophic damage became legendary. B-17s returned from missions with tail sections barely attached, wings shredded, engines gone, hydraulics destroyed. Aircraft landed with holes large enough to climb through. One famous B-17, all-American, nearly had its tail severed by a mid-air collision with a German fighter but managed to fly 90 miles back to base. The photographs of its damage seemed impossible, yet it had flown. This survivability wasn't accidental. It was engineered into every aspect of the design. The four-engine configuration meant redundancy. Lose one, even two engines, and the aircraft could still fly. The wing design was incredibly strong, capable of bearing loads far exceeding normal flight conditions. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, containing leaks that would have turned other aircraft into fireballs. The crew compartment had armor protecting critical positions. But the real secret was less tangible. The B-17 was fundamentally stable. Damaged aircraft didn't enter uncontrollable spins. Even with severe structural damage, pilots could maintain some level of control. This gave crews time to fight fires, throw out damaged equipment to reduce weight, restart failed engines, or prepare to bail out. That time, measured sometimes in seconds, sometimes in minutes, was the difference between death and survival for thousands of airmen. The strategic situation transformed in early 1944 with the arrival of long-range fighter escorts. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks could accompany the bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back. The fighter escort didn't eliminate bomber losses, but it changed the calculus fundamentally. Now German fighters had to fight through American fighters to reach the bombers. The hunters became hunted. The effect was immediate and devastating to the Luftwaffe. February 1944, big week, coordinated strikes against German aircraft production. The 8th Air Force lost 226 bombers but claimed over 600 German fighters destroyed. The Germans couldn't replace the losses, especially the pilots. By D-Day in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength. The B-17s, protected by their fighter escorts, had achieved air superiority over Europe. With fighter protection, the B-17 formations could focus on their primary mission, destroying German industry. Oil refineries went up in flames. Marshalling yards were cratered. Factories were leveled. The bombing became more accurate as crew experience increased and German defenses weakened. Industrial production didn't collapse as early strategists had predicted, but it was disrupted severely enough to matter. The targeting philosophy evolved from precision strikes on specific factories to broader attacks on industrial complexes and transportation networks. Cities with significant military production became targets. The distinction between military and civilian targets blurred. This was total war, and the B-17s were instruments of that totality. The moral implications troubled some aircrews, but the missions continued. They had orders and they flew them. By late 1944, the B-17 was operating in a permissive environment compared to 1943. Losses per mission dropped dramatically. The majority of aircraft returned undamaged. The crews who had survived the dark days of 1943 were now veterans training newcomers. The Memphis Belle and other famous aircraft completed their tour and returned to America for war bond tour, proof that survival was possible. The final missions of the war in Europe saw B-17 striking transportation and communication targets, crippling Germany's ability to move troops and supplies. They supported ground forces during the Battle of the Bulge, providing desperately needed aerial firepower when weather grounded tactical aircraft. They dropped supplies to resistance fighters and leaflets urging German surrender. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the B-17 had flown over 290,000 combat sorties, dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs, and suffered over 4,700 aircraft lost in combat. Behind those numbers were the human costs, over 46,500 casualties among 8th Air Force bomber crews alone. The price of the daylight bombing campaign had been paid in young men's lives, in crews that never came home, in the psychological scars carried by survivors. The strategic effectiveness remains debated. Did the bombing campaign shorten the war? German production actually increased in 1943 and early 1944 despite the raids, suggesting the campaign's impact was less than hoped. But the intangible effects were real. The Luftwaffe was destroyed defending against bombers. Resources were diverted to air defense. German civilians experienced the war's horror directly. And perhaps most importantly, the campaign forced Germany to fight a three-front war: east, west, and from the air. The B-17 itself proved several things that changed warfare permanently. High-altitude strategic bombing was feasible. Large-scale bomber operations could be sustained despite heavy losses. Industrial production could generate weapons in quantities that overwhelmed qualitative advantages. And perhaps most significantly, air power could be a decisive factor in modern warfare. The technological legacy was substantial. The turbo-supercharged engines enabled high-altitude operations that became standard for all subsequent bombers. The remote-controlled gun turrets pioneered technologies that would evolve into modern defensive systems. The oxygen systems, heated flight suits, and high-altitude equipment developed for B-17 crews became foundations for commercial aviation's move to high-altitude flight. The manufacturing achievement was equally significant. Building over 12,700 B-17s required coordination between multiple factories, thousands of subcontractors, and hundreds of thousands of workers. The logistics of moving parts, assembling aircraft, and delivering them to combat units was a massive undertaking that proved American industrial capacity could meet any challenge. These manufacturing and logistics systems, pioneered during B-17 production, became models for post-war industrial organization. The human stories reveal the aircraft's impact most clearly. The 10-man crews who flew these missions developed bonds that lasted lifetimes. Reunions of B-17 veterans drew crowds decades after the war. The shared experience of surviving the unsurvivable created connections deeper than normal friendships. These men had seen their friends die, had faced death themselves repeatedly, and had brought each other home against all odds. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warmer, a ball turret gunner who flew 30 missions, was interviewed in 1992 about his experiences. His description captured what the B-17 meant to its crews. "That airplane saved my life more times than I can count. I was in the ball turret, most vulnerable position on the aircraft. I watched fighters come straight at us, saw their guns firing, felt the impacts when they hit. But that fortress kept flying. One mission, we took a cannon shell through the waist. It killed both waist gunners instantly, wounded the radio operator, depressurized the aircraft. We were at 28,000 feet, should have gone down. The pilots got us to lower altitude on 2 engines. We made it back to England. That's what the B-17 did. It brought you home when you should have died." The aircraft's cultural impact extended beyond its military role. The Memphis Belle became the first B-17 to complete 25 missions, and its story was documented in a wartime film that became required viewing for training crews. The documentary footage of bombing missions, of fighters attacking, of damaged bombers struggling home, brought the air war into American homes in unprecedented ways. Post-war, surviving B-17s found varied uses. Some were converted to air-sea rescue aircraft, searching for downed pilots. Others became survey aircraft mapping remote regions. A few became executive transports for corporations. Many were simply scrapped, their aluminum recycled. By the 1960s, intact flying B-17s were rare. Today, fewer than a dozen remain airworthy, precious artifacts of an era when tens of thousands filled the skies over Europe. The preserved aircraft tell their stories through mission tallies painted on their fuselages, bomb symbols marking each sortie, swastikas indicating aerial victories. Some carry names like Memphis Belle, 909, or Aluminum Overcast, famous aircraft restored to flying condition. When these aircraft appear at airshows, veterans gather, many in wheelchairs now, pointing out positions where they once served. The sound of 4 radial engines starting brings tears to eyes that haven't cried in decades. The strategic bombing campaign's ethics remain controversial. The raids killed German civilians. Estimates range from 300,000 to 600,000 civilian deaths from all Allied bombing. Some historians argue the campaign diverted resources that could have been used more effectively elsewhere. Others contend the campaign was essential to victory, that without it, the war would have lasted years longer with far greater casualties. The B-17 crews themselves generally maintained they had done necessary work. They targeted military objectives. If civilians died, that was war's tragedy, not their intent. They had seen their friends die. They had nearly died themselves. They had done what was asked of them under circumstances of incredible danger. The moral burden of what they had participated in was something each man carried individually. What's undeniable is the courage required to climb into a B-17 and fly into German airspace knowing the odds. In 1943, completing a 25-mission tour was statistically unlikely. Yet crews continued flying. Some were motivated by duty, others by loyalty to their fellow crew members, still others by the simple need to finish what they'd started. Whatever their motivations, they demonstrated remarkable bravery repeatedly. The aircraft itself became a symbol of American power projection. The sight of hundreds of B-17s in formation, contrails marking the sky, represented America's ability to strike anywhere. The psychological impact on both sides was significant. For Germans, the daily raids demonstrated the Reich's vulnerability. For Americans, both military and civilian, the bomber offensive showed that America was carrying the fight to the enemy. The B-17's design influenced bomber development for decades. The 4-engine heavy bomber became the standard for strategic bombing. The B-29 that bombed Japan was an evolution of B-17 concepts. The B-52, which entered service in 1955 and remains operational today, traces its lineage through design philosophies established by the Flying Fortress. The idea that a bomber could be a multi-role platform capable of self-defense and precision attack came from the B-17. Modern precision-guided munitions have made the Norden bombsight obsolete, but they've fulfilled its promise. Today's bombers can hit precise targets from high altitude in any weather, something B-17 crews could only approximate. But the strategic concept, destroying enemy infrastructure from the air to cripple war-making capability, remains central to military doctrine. The B-17 proved it could work. The final accounting shows 12,731 B-17s built at a total cost of approximately $3 billion. Over 25,000 airmen died in 8th Air Force operations alone. The Pacific Theater added more casualties. The bombing campaign consumed resources that might have shortened the war if used differently, but it also achieved objectives that couldn't have been reached any other way. Germany's air force was destroyed. Its industrial base was disrupted. And the precedent was established that air power would be decisive in future conflicts. When the last B-17 combat mission was flown on April 25, 1945, it marked the end of an era. The piston-engine bomber's dominance was already being challenged by jets. The atomic bomb would make mass bomber raids obsolete for strategic warfare. But the B-17 had established principles that would guide military aviation for generations. Crews had proven human endurance under conditions that seemed unbearable. And an aircraft had demonstrated that good engineering, backed by industrial might, could create weapons that changed history. The men who flew the B-17 never claimed to have won the war alone. They understood they were one part of a vast military machine, but they knew they had been essential. Without the bombing campaign, Germany could have devoted full resources to the eastern and western fronts. Without air superiority, D-Day might have failed. Without the destruction of transportation networks, German resistance might have lasted months longer. Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, reflected decades later on what the B-17 meant. It was just an airplane, aluminum, steel, rubber, and fabric, but it was also more than that. It was our home when we were over Germany. It was the machine that stood between us and death, and somehow, against all logic, it usually brought us back. I've flown many aircraft since the war. None of them ever meant what that B-17 meant. It was the airplane that let us do impossible things, and it was the airplane that brought us home. The B-17 Flying Fortress didn't win World War II by itself. No single weapon system could. But it was an essential instrument of victory, a weapon that allowed American industrial might and aircrew courage to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany. It proved that strategic bombing could work, even when the cost seemed unbearable. And it established precedents for air warfare that remain relevant 8 decades later. In the end, the B-17's legacy isn't just military. It's human. It's the story of young men who faced death repeatedly and somehow found the courage to keep flying. It's the story of an aircraft that became legendary for bringing those men home. And it's the story of how technology, courage, and industrial capacity combined to change the course of history. The Flying Fortress earned its name not through invincibility, but through resilience. It could be hurt, but it couldn't be stopped. And in that resilience lay the key to Allied victory in the skies over Europe.